Redditor 1. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me as a kid. Sure, bits and pieces have slipped out over the years, usually after too many drinks or during those rare 3 a.m. conversations when the world feels a little less real. But the complete truth? That stayed locked away, festering in the darkest corners of my mind. Until now. It started when I was 12. Just a normal kid, living in a normal house with normal parents who argued about normal things like kitchen renovations and mortgage payments. Nothing in my life suggested I'd become the focus of something otherworldly. The first time it happened, I was lying in my bed, drifting in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness. My TV hummed quietly in the background. I always kept it on for comfort, even though Mom complained about the electricity bill. The familiar blue glow painted shadows across my bedroom walls, creating strange patterns that my tired mind transformed into shapes and faces. That's when I heard it, a subtle rustling sound coming from my desk drawer. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe our cat getting into things again. But when I tried to turn my head to look, I couldn't move. Not an inch. It was like my entire body had been encased in invisible concrete, leaving only my eyes free to dart around in panic. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. This wasn't the random noise of settling wood or curious pets. This was something searching. And then came the static. It started as a low hum, barely distinguishable from the TV's background noise, but it grew, swelling into a turbulent roar that seemed to fill every molecule of air in my room. The sound wasn't just in my ears. It vibrated through my teeth, resonated in my chest cavity, made my bones feel like they were about to shatter. That's when the lifting began. I felt it first as a lightness, like the moment you crest the top of a roller coaster. Then my body began to rise, still paralyzed, still helpless. The ceiling grew closer, my blanket sliding off my rigid form. The static grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, my fear, everything except the sensation of floating. Then, just as suddenly, I dropped. The impact knocked the wind out of me and I lay there gasping, finally able to move but too terrified to do anything except clutch my blanket and pray for morning. When the sun finally rose, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Just a weird dream brought on by too much late-night TV. I didn't tell anyone who would believe me. And eventually, the memory faded to the background of my mind, filed away with other childhood fears and half-remembered dreams. Until 5 years later, when it happened again. By then, we'd done some remodeling. I'd moved to the next room over, my old bedroom now occupied by my uncle who was staying with us temporarily. My new room was different. A sturdy sleigh bed with wooden slats faced the closet, and my parents had put an old side table with a lamp in front of the bed while they renovated the living room. I was dealing with some health issues at the time, embarrassing cysts in my groin that made sleeping uncomfortable. Maybe that's why I was only half asleep that night, floating in that familiar, liminal space between consciousness and dreams. The static came first this time. I recognized it immediately, that same bone-rattling frequency that had haunted my dreams for years. My body began to lift, but this time some deep survival instinct kicked in. My hands shot out, grabbing the wooden slats of my bed. I held on with everything I had, fighting against the invisible force that tried to pull me upward. That's when I saw it. A movement caught my eye, something peeking out from my closet. At first, it was just a shape, a darkness deeper than the shadows around it. But as I watched, frozen in terror, it began to change. Like wet clay being molded by invisible hands, the features shifted and flowed until I was staring at a perfect copy of a girl I knew from school. The sight was so shocking, so wrong that my grip loosened. I fell back against my mattress and the world grew hazy around the edges. Through the fog of semi-consciousness, I felt a sharp pain in my groin, right where the cysts were. It felt like someone or something was prodding them with cold, precise fingers. The static rose to a crescendo and suddenly I was fully awake, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I bolted from my room, running on pure adrenaline and nearly collided with my uncle in the hallway. "Uncle Mike," I gasped, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I think I think I just got abducted." I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was just having a bad dream. Instead, all the color drained from his face. In the dim hallway light, he looked like he'd aged 10 years in an instant. "Honey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think something was in my room last night, too." He told me about the 3 small gray figures that had appeared by his bed, my old bed. How they'd laughed with voices like grinding metal as they punched at him, their fists passing through his body like smoke whenever he tried to fight back. "They were looking for you," he said, and I knew he was right. They'd gone to my old room first, not knowing I'd moved. Looking back now, there are details that make it even more terrifying. The side table and lamp that should have blocked my view of the closet, they weren't there that night. Somehow the entities had moved them without making a sound, and in the months leading up to the second incident, I'd seen things in the night sky, strange lights that moved in impossible ways, darting across the stars before vanishing in bursts of impossible speed. Once, I wasn't alone when I saw them. My friend Sarah was with me, and she saw them too, though we never talked about it after that night. I've moved several times since then, always telling myself it's for normal reasons, better job opportunities, nicer neighborhoods, cheaper rent. But deep down, I know I'm running. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't whether they'll find me again. It's whether they ever really let me go. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear the faintest hint of static in the background. It might be coming from my TV or my phone or the neighbor's radio. But maybe, just maybe, it's them. Searching, waiting, ready to finish whatever they started all those years ago. And on those nights, I hold onto my bed frame until my knuckles turn white. And I pray that this time, they'll pass me by. But they never do. Redditor 2. The boxes in my great-grandfather's attic had remained untouched for decades, until that rainy October afternoon. My mother had asked me to help clear out the old house on Oldra Hill before the state took over the last parcel of our family's land. I hadn't been back since I was a kid, but the winding road up the mountain felt somehow smaller now, narrower, as if the forest had been slowly reclaiming it all these years. The house still stood proud against the gray New York sky, though its white paint had long since surrendered to weather and time. My great-great-grandfather Oldra had built this road himself, carved it into the mountainside, with nothing but determination and hand tools. The family stories say he worked through 2 winters to complete it, refusing to stop even when the snow came. Nobody ever knew why he was so desperate to live at the top. I found the journal in a water-stained cardboard box, wedged between Christmas decorations from the 1950s and my grandmother's old wedding dress. The leather cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside were still crisp, filled with my great-grandfather's precise handwriting. The first entry was dated 1923. "Dear, watching the house again. Mary says I'm imagining things, but I know what I see in the tree line after sunset. The lights aren't stars. Stars don't move like that. Stars don't follow you with their gaze." I shouldn't have kept reading, should have put it back in the box, taped it shut, and left it for the cleanup crew. But there was something in those words that pulled at memories I'd tried to forget, whispered stories shared around family dinners when the adults thought we kids weren't listening. March 15, 1924. Found strange marks in the field today. Perfect circle, 40 feet across, every blade of grass laid flat, like it had been pressed down by something heavy. No tracks leading in or out. The cows won't go near it. My hands were trembling slightly as I turned the pages. I remembered my grandfather's story about the crabapple tree, the one he'd told me on my 13th birthday. How he'd seen figures in the field at dusk, how they'd moved in ways that weren't quite right. I'd always assumed it was just a story meant to scare me, but now, June 8, 1924. Mary saw them tonight, says she won't sleep upstairs anymore, says their shadows pass across our bedroom ceiling, even when there's nothing outside to cast them. I've moved our bed to the first floor, but it won't help. They know we're here. The attic suddenly felt colder. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the old house creak and settle around me. I checked my phone, 4:47 p.m. The sun would be setting in less than an hour. August 21, 1924. I understand now why Father built the road, why he chose this spot. They were already here, have always been here. The mountain doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing but dust motes dancing in the beam of sunlight from the small window. But when I turned back to the journal, there was a new sound, a low, steady hum just at the edge of hearing. The next entry was different, the handwriting frantic, pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. They're in the walls, they're in the walls, they're in the walls. I slammed the journal shut, but I could still hear that hum getting louder now. It reminded me of something, a story my mother had told me once, about a strange aircraft that had buzzed over her and my aunt when they were teenagers. The way she described that odd colored light on its underside. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the attic in deep orange shadows. I should leave, should get in my car and drive down that winding road before full dark. But my legs wouldn't move, because I could see them now, through the dirty attic window, standing in the field where my grandfather had once hidden in that crabapple tree. Tall, impossibly thin figures, their edges seeming to blur and shift in the dying light. They were looking up at the house, looking up at me. My phone died with a sudden electronic chirp, plunging me into the growing darkness. The humming was inside the house now, vibrating through the floorboards, through my bones. And I finally understood why my great-great-grandfather had built this road, had put so much sweat and blood into reaching this precise spot on the mountain. It wasn't to keep something out. It was to give them a way in. The figures were moving across the field now, their movements jerky and wrong, like film played at the wrong speed. I could hear something climbing the stairs to the attic, each step accompanied by a sound like metal dragging across stone. The journal fell from my numb fingers as I backed away from the door. In the last light of day, I saw one final entry, dated the day before my great-grandfather disappeared. They've been patient, so patient. For 3 generations they've waited, watching us tend their gateway. But now they say it's time to fulfill the bargain great-grandfather made when he built this road, when he gave them a path to our world. I'm sorry for what comes next. The attic door began to open, letting in a strange, pulsing light that had no place in our reality. And in that moment, I realized something that turned my blood to ice. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. Because I was an Oldra. And on this hill, in this house, with these watchers from beyond, our family's debt was finally coming due. The door swung wide, and they came to collect. That was 3 years ago. I still live in the house on Oldra Hill, though the state's paperwork shows it as abandoned. Sometimes hikers from the nearby campground wander up the old road, drawn by curiosity about the dilapidated house at the top. I watch them from the windows, silently willing them to leave before sunset. Before the humming starts, before the figures emerge from the tree line. Most of them do leave. Some don't. And on clear nights, when the stars wheel overhead and the lights that aren't stars dance between them, I sit in the attic and write in my great-grandfather's journal, adding my own entries, recording what I see, what they tell me, what they show me, because someone needs to keep the records. Someone needs to remember. After all, I'm an Oldra, and on this hill, watching is what we do until they decide it's time for us to do something else. Redditor 3. The fluorescent numbers on my dashboard read 3:17 a.m. when I first noticed the light. I'd been driving for hours, my hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the endless stretch of Interstate 5 ahead. The coffee I'd grabbed in San Francisco had gone cold hours ago, but I didn't need it anymore. The empty expanse of the valley kept me alert in a way caffeine never could. At that hour, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the occasional rustle of agricultural fields, you start to notice things. The way your headlights catch the reflective markers on the road, creating a hypnotic rhythm. The subtle vibrations of the steering wheel beneath your palms. The absolute void beyond the reach of your high beams. There was no moon that night, just pitch blackness pressing against my windows like a living thing, held at bay by the thin barrier of glass and metal I called my car. The speedometer hovered around 75, maybe pushing 80. Standard California driving, really. Nobody follows the actual speed limit here. I was alone on the road, had been for at least 20 minutes. The last car I'd seen was heading northbound, its taillights disappearing into the darkness like dying embers. That's why the sudden appearance of light in my rearview mirror was so startling. At first, I thought it was another car, though I couldn't figure out where it had come from. The light was bright, almost painfully so. A strange yellowish that reminded me of old photographs, the kind where the flash bleached everything out, but it wasn't coming from behind me. It was approaching from my right. My right, where there was no road, no shoulder, nothing but open fields and darkness. The light accelerated, moving faster than any car I'd ever seen. It blazed past me on the right side, close enough that I instinctively jerked the wheel left before correcting. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched it surge ahead, expecting it to continue into the distance. Instead, it slowed, matched my speed exactly, kept pace about 50 yards ahead of me, floating alongside the highway like some kind of ghostly escort. I blinked hard, tried to focus, tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A train, maybe? But there were no tracks here, and besides, I couldn't hear anything. No rumble of engines, no screech of metal on metal, just the whisper of my tires on asphalt and my own increasingly rapid breathing. What the hell, I muttered, pressing down on the accelerator. The needle crept up, 85, 90, 95. The light stayed exactly the same distance ahead, moving in perfect synchronization. I eased off, dropped down to 60. Still, it maintained that precise gap, as if we were connected by an invisible tether. 5 minutes passed, then 10. My knuckles had gone white on the steering wheel. I flashed my high beams, more out of desperate frustration than any real hope it would do something. The light didn't react. It just kept pace, that steady, sickly glow, hovering at the edge of the highway. My mouth had gone dry. I wanted to reach for my water bottle in the cup holder, but couldn't make myself take my hands off the wheel. Something about that light felt wrong. Aware. Like it was waiting for something. That's when the thought crept in, I should pull over, just for a minute, just to see what it is. The idea filled my head like smoke, crowding out everything else. My right foot started to move toward the brake pedal of its own accord. It would be so easy, just ease onto the shoulder, put it in park, step out into the night. Don't stop it or don't stop. The thought hit me like a mental thunderclap, so loud and clear it might as well have been someone screaming in my ear. My foot jerked back from the brake like it had been burned. Cold sweat trickled down my spine as I realized how close I'd come to actually doing it, to stepping out of my car alone in the middle of nowhere, in the darkest part of the night. The moment I made the conscious decision not to stop, the light froze. It didn't slow down or fade away. It simply stopped, as if it had slammed into an invisible wall. I shot past it, my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. I couldn't help myself. I looked in the rearview mirror. The light hung there, perfectly still, like a tear in the fabric of reality. As I watched, the road dipped and curved, and the mysterious glow disappeared behind a rolling hill. A minute later, I saw headlights approaching from the opposite direction. The first normal traffic I'd seen in what felt like hours. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was halfway to Los Angeles. Even now, a decade later, I can recall every detail of that night with perfect clarity. The emptiness of the road, the quality of the darkness, the sickly yellowish white of that light. Sometimes I'll be driving at night and catch a glimpse of something bright in my peripheral vision, and my heart will skip a beat before I realize it's just a street lamp or a passing car. But what really haunts me isn't the memory of what happened. It's the question of what would have happened if I'd listened to that first impulse. If I'd pulled over. If I'd stepped out of my car. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I'll find myself on Google Maps, tracing that stretch of I-5 through the valley. I'll look at the satellite view of those empty fields alongside the highway, searching for something. Train tracks that don't exist. Signs of whatever might have been waiting out there in the darkness. I never find anything, of course. just endless agricultural land stretching away from the highway. But every now and then, I'll come across a news article about someone who went missing along that stretch of road, usually at night, usually traveling alone. The reports always end the same way: no trace found, case remains open. And I'll think about that light, still out there somewhere in the darkness, waiting for someone else who doesn't hear that warning voice in time. I've never told anyone this story before, partly because I know how it sounds, just another late-night driver's hallucination, born from fatigue and isolation, but mostly because even now, years later, I can still feel the pull of that light, still remember how compelling that urge to stop was, how reasonable it seemed in the moment. Sometimes I dream about it. In the dreams, I do pull over. I do step out of the car, and as I walk toward that sickly yellow white glow, I start to see something taking shape within it. Something that's been waiting all these years, patient and hungry, for someone to finally stop. Those are the nights I wake up grateful for whatever part of my mind screamed that warning. Because deep down, I know that if I had stopped that night, there wouldn't have been any missing persons report, no open case file, no trace at all. Just another empty car on the side of I-5, doors open, engine running, driver's seat still warm, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the highway, a light moving on to the next traveler, waiting for someone who doesn't hear the voice that says, "Don't stop the car." Redditor 4. I've never told anyone the whole truth about my scar. Even now, typing these words makes my fingers tremble slightly, hovering over the keyboard as that familiar unease creeps back. My parents know part of it, the simple version I shared when I was 8. But there's more. So much more that I've kept buried for over 2 decades. I remember that night with unsettling clarity. Mom tucked me in as usual, her flowery perfume lingering as she kissed my forehead. Dad followed with his standard, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite routine. The digital clock on my nightstand read 9:15 p.m. when I drifted off, wrapped in my favorite Pokemon blanket, feeling completely normal and safe. The dreams started almost immediately. Usually I don't remember my dreams, but these were different. I recall floating, weightless, in a space that wasn't quite dark, but wasn't light either. The air felt thick, like breathing through syrup, and there was this constant, low humming sound. Not mechanical, but not natural either. Something in between, like the sound you hear when you press your ears too hard, but deeper, more purposeful. I remember faces. Not human faces, not exactly. They were too smooth, too symmetrical, with eyes that reflected light like cat's eyes, but were much, much larger. They moved around me with precise, almost mechanical movements, their long fingers trailing across my skin, leaving trails of cold numbness wherever they touched. I tried to speak, to cry out, but my voice wouldn't work. My body felt heavy, yet weightless at the same time, like being suspended in invisible jelly. The beings communicated, not with words, but with colors that pulsed between them. Blues and greens that somehow carried meaning I could almost, but not quite, understand. There was a moment of sharp pressure just above my navel, but no pain. I remember watching with detached fascination as they worked, their movements quick and efficient. One of them held something that looked like a thin rod of light, but it moved like liquid silver. The others were monitoring something I couldn't see, their huge eyes reflecting patterns of data I couldn't comprehend. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through my window, and everything felt normal for exactly 3 seconds. Then I felt it, a strange tightness in my abdomen. I pulled up my pajama top, and there it was, a vertical scar, about 3 centimeters long, sitting just above my belly button. The scar wasn't fresh and red like a new cut. Instead, it was pink and slightly raised, with that peculiar bumpy texture that old scars have. It looked weeks, maybe months old. I touched it gently, expecting pain, but felt nothing except a slight numbness around the edges. I showed my parents, of course. They examined it with growing concern, exchanging those worried glances parents think kids don't notice. Mom suggested I might have scratched myself in my sleep, but we all knew that was impossible. The scar was too neat, too surgical. Dad mentioned taking me to the doctor, but something made me protest. A deep, instinctive fear I couldn't explain. We didn't pursue it further. Life went on, and the scar became just another quirk, like my double-jointed thumbs or the birthmark on my shoulder. But things started happening, small things at first, easily dismissed. I began waking up at exactly 3:33 a.m. every night. My body rigid, that same humming sound from my dreams echoing in my ears. My room would feel different during these moments. Colder, but not in temperature. It was like the air itself had become thin, almost artificial. Then there were the numbers. I started seeing patterns everywhere, in license plates, phone numbers, receipts. They seemed to be trying to tell me something, but I could never quite piece it together. The scar would tingle whenever these number sequences appeared, like it was acknowledging some hidden truth. I developed strange abilities too. I could sometimes predict exactly when someone would call or text, seconds before it happened. I knew when it was going to rain, not through any meteorological knowledge, but because the scar would itch in a specific way. These weren't dramatic superpowers, just subtle shifts in perception that made me feel increasingly disconnected from the normal world. The scar stayed with me for exactly 2 years, 7 months, and 12 days. I know because I marked it on my calendar, counting each day, watching as it slowly faded. But even as it disappeared, the changes it brought remained. Now, at nearly 30, I still wake up sometimes in the early hours, that familiar humming in my ears. The scar may be gone, but I can still feel it. A phantom sensation that pulses in time with certain frequencies I'm not supposed to be able to hear. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can see faint reflections in mirrors or windows. Those same smooth faces with their large, knowing eyes, watching, waiting. I've had numerous medical tests over the years trying to find some rational explanation. MRIs, CT scans, blood work. They all come back normal. Too normal, actually. The doctors always comment on how perfect everything looks, how textbook my results are. It's as if something cleaned up my insides, optimized everything to an impossible standard. Last week I found an old photo from when I was 10 showing the scar in clear detail. I uploaded it to a medical imaging forum, seeking answers. Within hours, the photo was removed, my account was deleted, and for the next 3 days I noticed a black car parked across from my apartment. The scar may have faded, but its mystery has only grown deeper. Sometimes I catch myself touching that spot above my navel, remembering the beings with their liquid light tools and communication in colors. I wonder what they did to me, what purpose that small surgical mark served. Was it an experiment, a tracking device, some kind of enhancement, or something else entirely, something my human mind can't even comprehend? The rational part of me wants to dismiss it all. The dreams, the numbers, the unexplainable abilities. But then I'll wake up at 3:33 a.m., my room filled with that familiar syrupy air, and I'll know that somewhere out there they're still watching, still monitoring whatever they put inside me all those years ago. I'm sharing this now because lately the numbers have been getting more frequent, more insistent. The patterns are converging towards something, and my old scar tingles with an intensity I haven't felt since childhood. Something is coming. I don't know what, but I can feel it in every fiber of my being. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there like me, carrying their own mysterious scars and unexplainable memories. If you're reading this and it resonates, if you've ever woken up changed in ways you can't explain, check your old photographs. Look for that same vertical mark just above your navel, and if you find it, pay attention to the numbers. They're trying to tell us something. The humming is getting louder now. It always does when I think about that night too much. But at least now you know the truth, or as much of it as I dare to share. Because some nights, when the world grows quiet, and that familiar frequency fills my room, I swear I can hear them whispering, soon. Redditor 5. I've never told anyone what happened that night 6 months ago. Even now, my hands shake as I type this, and every strange sound makes me flinch. But I need to get this out. Maybe then someone can tell me I'm not crazy, that what I experienced wasn't just some twisted dream. I was 17, fresh off a late-night baseball game. Our team had won, but I was too exhausted to celebrate with the others. The clock had just struck midnight when I collapsed onto my bed, still wearing my dusty uniform. The steady whir of my ceiling fan provided a comforting white noise as I mindlessly flipped through channels on the TV, too tired to even change into something more comfortable. I remember everything about those last normal moments: the warm yellow glow of my bedside lamp, the lingering smell of field dirt on my cleats by the door, even the slight pain in my shoulder from pitching 7 innings. What I don't remember is falling asleep. One blink, that's all it took. When I opened my eyes again, everything was wrong. The familiar weight of my uniform was gone, replaced by bare skin against sheets that felt too rough, too foreign. Suffocating darkness pressed in from all sides. I was under my covers, but they felt heavy, almost deliberately placed. My body was slick with sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The silence hit me first. That endless, vacuum-like silence where the fan should have been humming. The kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound, any proof that the world hasn't just stopped existing. I lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to convince myself this was just another episode of sleep paralysis. But this was different. In sleep paralysis, I couldn't move. Now I could. I just didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I was still asleep, like a child hiding from monsters, as if the thin barrier of a blanket could offer any real protection. Finally, the need to know overcame the fear. I reached out from under the covers, fumbling for the lamp switch. Click, nothing. Click, click, click. The darkness remained absolute. My phone. Where was my phone? I forced myself to sit up, letting the covers fall away. The air in my room felt different, thicker, almost metallic. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out shapes in the darkness: my desk, my dresser, the outline of my door. But something about their placement seemed subtly wrong, like furniture in a dream where everything is just slightly off-center. The fan above my bed was motionless, despite the switch being in the on position. The TV screen was black, lifeless, and there, barely visible in the dim light filtering through my window blinds, was my baseball uniform, crumpled in a heap by the door, as if it had been carelessly discarded, or removed, or My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up. 6:02 a.m. 6 hours. I had lost 6 hours. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I never sleep naked. Never. Even in the hottest summer nights, I wear shorts at minimum. And I definitely hadn't undressed before lying down. I remembered the scratch of my uniform against my skin as I'd watched TV. Something cold and heavy settled in the pit of my stomach as more details emerged from the fog of missing time. The uniform wasn't just discarded, it was arranged too perfectly, laid out flat like a shed skin. And there was something else about it, something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was completely clean. No dirt, no grass stains, not even the sweat marks that had been there when I'd come home. I got up on unsteady legs, every movement feeling somehow wrong, like my body wasn't quite mine anymore. The floor was ice cold against my bare feet as I approached the uniform. That's when I noticed the marks. They started at my doorway, 3 parallel lines, so faint I might have missed them in better light, running along the baseboards. They looked almost like scratch marks, but too precise, too deliberate. They continued past my uniform and disappeared under my bed. My heart was trying to climb up my throat as I knelt down, using my phone's flashlight to peer under the bed frame. The marks continued underneath, converging in a pattern I couldn't quite make out. But what made me scramble backward in panic wasn't the marks. It was the smell. An acrid chemical odor that reminded me of burned metal and something else. Something organic and wrong. I backed away until I hit my desk, nearly knocking over my laptop. The screen flickered to life at the impact, and I saw my reflection in the black glass, pale, wide-eyed, and covered in goosebumps. But it wasn't until I turned slightly that I saw them. The marks on my skin. They were barely visible, like faded bruises, but they formed distinct patterns across my chest and arms. Perfect geometric shapes, too regular to be natural. Some looked like circles, others like triangles, but they all seemed to point to something on my left shoulder blade. When I twisted to see it in the reflection, I nearly screamed. There, raised slightly like a fresh scar, was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked almost like writing, but no writing system I knew used angles quite like that. And it seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim light, like oil on water. The next few hours are a blur in my memory. I know I took pictures, dozens of them, documenting every mark, every strange detail. But when I checked my phone later that morning, they were gone. Not deleted, just never taken. The timestamp on my photos jumped from 11:58 p.m. to 6:15 a.m., like those 6 hours had never existed. I tried to tell my parents, but the words wouldn't come out right. How do you explain something like this? Even now, 6 months later, I struggle to describe what happened. The marks faded within days, including the symbol on my shoulder. The scratch marks on my floor disappeared too, like they'd been absorbed into the wood. But things aren't the same. I can't sleep with my fan on anymore. The sound reminds me too much of that night, of whatever replaced its steady hum in those missing hours. I've covered every window in my room with blackout curtains, but sometimes I still see lights. Not regular lights, but pulses of color that shouldn't exist, dancing at the edges of my vision. And the dreams, God, the dreams. They're not like normal nightmares. They feel more like memories trying to surface, full of strange angles and impossible geometries. Sometimes I wake up tasting metal, my sheets soaked with sweat, certain that if I just turned my head quickly enough, I'd catch them watching me. The worst part? Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear the fan start up on its own. But it's not the same sound it used to make. It's higher pitched, almost musical, like it's trying to speak. And in those moments, lying in the dark, I become absolutely certain of one thing. They're coming back. They're coming back, and next time, they won't just take 6 hours. They'll take me. Redditor 6? The scratching of my pen against paper feels wrong somehow, like I'm breaking an unspoken rule by finally writing this down. Dad never wanted me to share his story, said some things were better left in the dark corners of memory. But after what happened last week, I need to understand. Maybe by piecing together the patterns in our family's history, I can make sense of why they keep coming back. It started in 1987, back when Dad was 23 and still had that rebellious spark that would eventually fade into careful routine. He'd just gotten his first real job at the lumber mill, and to celebrate 3 months of steady paychecks, he decided to take his beat-up Ford F-150 out for a solo camping trip in the Cascade Mountains. Just needed to clear my head, he told me years later, his calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Your grandfather had just passed, and the mill was riding me hard about production quotas. Sometimes a man needs to get lost to find himself again. He'd driven out past the logging roads, following old Forest Service maps until he found a clearing that seemed to catch the last rays of sunset just right. The meadow stretched out like a golden bowl, cradled by dense pine forest on 3 sides and backed by the jagged silhouette of Mount Baker. Dad always said it was the most beautiful spot he'd ever found, right up until it wasn't. The evening started normally enough. He built a small fire, heated up some beans in a tin can, and watched the sky fade from orange to purple to that deep mountain black that city folks never really get to see. The September air had that crisp edge to it, warning of the winter to come, but it wasn't cold enough yet to need a tent. Dad had this habit of sleeping on the hood of his truck when he camped alone. Said the angle was perfect if you had a good sleeping bag and didn't mind a bit of engine warmth seeping through the metal. I must have dozed off for a bit, he wrote in the journal I found last month, hidden in a box of old tax returns. When I opened my eyes again, the fire had burned down to embers, and that's when I noticed the lights. At first, he thought they were just headlights from other vehicles winding down the mountain roads, but something about their movement caught his attention. They didn't follow any road pattern he knew, and he knew those mountains better than most. The lights, 3 of them, arranged in a triangle, would drift down the mountainside, stop, then float back up again, like a yo-yo being played with by an invisible hand. Dad said time got strange then. He'd check his watch, but the numbers wouldn't make sense. The lights kept moving, and he kept watching, unable to look away. They'd get closer, close enough that he could see they weren't yellow like headlights, but a pale, sickly green that reminded him of hospital corridors. Then they'd retreat, becoming distant pinpricks against the black bulk of the mountain. The worst part, he told me on my 16th birthday, after 3 beers had loosened his tongue, was the silence. You know how the mountains are never really quiet? There's always wind in the trees, or birds, or something rustling in the underbrush. But while those lights were dancing, it was like someone had pressed the mute button on the world. He doesn't remember falling asleep, or if he slept at all. The next thing he clearly recalls is opening his eyes to find the sun high overhead, his clothes soaked with dew. His watch had stopped at 11:47 p.m., and his truck's battery was dead, though he swears he hadn't left any lights on. It took him 3 hours to hike out to the main road and flag down help. When they finally got his truck jumped, the radio clock showed it was 2:15 p.m., nearly 14 hours after he first noticed the lights. Dad never could account for that lost time, and it aided him for years. I might have dismissed it as just another campfire story if it weren't for my cousin Tommy. He was 4 years younger than me, and growing up, he had an imaginary friend he called the Green Man. Tommy would spend hours in the backyard having animated conversations with thin air. His parents thought it was cute, until the night they found him sitting in the garden at 3 a.m., crying because his friend had to go back up. When Tommy was 7, he drew a picture in school that got him sent to the counselor. It showed 3 green circles arranged in a triangle, hovering over what looked like mountains. In the corner, he'd drawn a stick figure laying on what might have been a car, watching. Tommy had never heard Dad's story. I'm writing this now because last Tuesday, I was driving home late from Seattle. The mountain road was empty, and my podcast had faded to static an hour back. That's when I saw them in my rearview mirror. 3 green lights, arranged in a perfect triangle, falling and rising like a cosmic pendulum. My hands are shaking as I write this next part. I checked my phone when I finally pulled into my driveway. 3:47 a.m. The last text I sent my wife was at 11:47 p.m., telling her I was about an hour from home. The drive should have taken 50 minutes, tops. There's something else. This morning, I found Tommy's old drawing while cleaning out my mom's attic. On the back, in careful child's handwriting, was a message I'd never noticed before. They said they're watching over us until it's time. I called Dad after finding the drawing, hoping he could help me make sense of it all. But when I mentioned the lights, he got quiet in that way that always meant trouble when I was a kid. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're getting closer, aren't they?" That was 3 days ago. Dad's not answering his phone anymore, and Tommy posted something strange on Facebook about going camping in the Cascades. I tried calling him too, but it went straight to voicemail. The timestamp on his last post? 11:47 p.m. I'm leaving this account here because something tells me I won't be around much longer to tell it in person. Last night, I woke up to find my bedroom filled with a sickly green glow. When I looked out the window, I saw 3 lights hovering in the backyard, arranged in that familiar triangle. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The strangest part? I wasn't afraid. For the first time, I understood why Dad kept going back to those mountains, why Tommy spent so many nights in the garden. They've been watching our family for generations, waiting for something, and now, I think, it's finally time. If you're reading this, look up at the mountains on a clear night. If you see 3 green lights moving in ways that lights shouldn't move, don't look away. They might choose you too. Just remember, time doesn't mean the same thing to them as it does to us. And whatever you do, don't check your watch at 11:47 p.m. That's when they like to come down from the mountains to play. Redditor 7. I still check my window every night before going to bed. Not that it would make any difference. They proved they could get through locked doors and walls like they were nothing more than projections. But old habits die hard, especially when they're born from trauma. It happened back in April, though I've spent months trying to convince myself it was just a dream. Writing this down feels like finally admitting to myself that it was real. Maybe that's why I've avoided it for so long. I was at Jake's house that night, like most Fridays. We'd been friends since middle school, and our weekly gaming sessions were sacred. Usually, I'd drive myself home, but my car was in the shop, something about the transmission fluid leaking. Dad agreed to pick me up, probably more out of pity than anything else. He always said I needed to woman up about driving at night. It was about 10:30 when we left Jake's neighborhood. The spring air had that peculiar dampness that comes before rain, and thick clouds blanketed the sky like a heavy wool blanket. I remember being disappointed. I always liked looking at stars on night drives. They made me feel less alone somehow. I was just about to plug my earbuds in when it happened. The clouds above us split. That's the only way I can describe it. A massive, circular light, bigger than any spotlight I'd ever seen, pierced through the cloud cover. It hung there for what felt like both an eternity and a split second, then suddenly zoomed overhead with impossible speed. No sound, no wind, just movement. "What was that?" I practically screamed, twisting around in my seat so fast my seatbelt locked. "Did you see that, Dad? Tell me you saw that." Dad barely glanced up from the road. "Probably just the police helicopter. They've been doing more patrols lately." But I knew what I saw. No helicopter could move like that or shine through clouds that thick. And helicopters make noise. This thing was dead silent. My hands were shaking when I texted Jake. Something weird just happened, like really weird. He called immediately. I told him everything, and unlike my dad, he listened, really listened. "Could it have been a plane?" he asked. But I could tell he didn't believe that any more than I did. To Jake, it was perfectly circular, and the way it moved, nothing moves like that, nothing human. Anyway. By the time I got home, my skin was crawling. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, but 1,000 times worse. I double-checked every lock, closed every blind, and still couldn't shake it. I didn't want to sleep. I really didn't want to sleep. I put on Netflix, tried to distract myself with mindless comedy shows, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Was that shadow always there? Did that tree branch always curve that way? I must have dozed off eventually, though I don't remember it happening. What I do remember, with crystal clarity, is waking up at exactly 2 a.m. The first thing I noticed was wrong was the silence. Not just quiet, absolute silence. No hum from my laptop fan, no distant traffic, no house settling sounds, nothing. Then I noticed the light. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific. The whole room seemed to be glowing with a pale bluish tint, like moonlight, but wrong somehow. Artificial. I tried to move, I couldn't. That's when I saw them. They weren't like the movies. No big black eyes or gray skin. These were worse. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in ways that made my brain hurt to look at. Their skin was translucent, like jellyfish, with something dark moving underneath. 3 of them stood around my bed, looking down at me with what I can only describe as scientific curiosity. The 4th one, and I know there was a 4th though I never saw it directly, was doing something behind my head. I could feel pressure, like fingers pressing against my skull, but not from the outside, from the inside. One of them reached out with what might have been a hand. The fingers, were they fingers? Were too long, too jointed, like spider legs made of glass. It held something that looked like a needle, but it moved like liquid mercury. I wanted to scream, I tried to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. "The subject is aware," one of them said, except they didn't speak. The words just appeared in my head, accompanied by a sensation like ice water running down my spine. "Increase the suppression." The pressure in my head intensified. I felt my consciousness starting to slip away, but before it did, I caught a glimpse of something on one of their arms. A symbol or marking that looked disturbingly familiar. It was the same shape I'd been absently doodling in my notebooks for months, never knowing why or where I'd seen it. The next thing I knew, my phone was ringing. It was Jake. "Sarah?" His voice was shaking. "Sarah, are you okay? I just woke up and I had this feeling, like something was wrong." "With you." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming. My whole body ached like I'd run a marathon. And there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold. My sheets were clean and perfectly made, which was impossible because I never make my bed, ever. But more than that, they were different sheets, different pattern, different material. Most of the time, I'm unmeticulous. I forget everything. Jay, I managed to croak out. What time is it? Just after 2 a.m., he said. I had this dream. You were there, but not really you. And there were these things. I cut him off. Tall? Like impossibly tall? With transparent skin? The silence on the other end of the line was all the confirmation I needed. That was 6 months ago. Jake and I have talked about it countless times, trying to make sense of what happened. We've discovered other things too, identical small scars behind our ears that neither of us can explain, strange gaps in our memories from that night, and sometimes, when we're together, our phones stop working at exactly 2 a.m. But the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night and makes me check my window compulsively, it's the certainty, the bone-deep, undeniable certainty that they're not done with us. Sometimes I catch glimpses of that same bluish light reflecting off my neighbor's windows. Sometimes my sheets are different in the morning, and sometimes, just sometimes, I wake up with that same full-body ache and the lingering sensation of spider-leg fingers in my mind. I know they're watching, I know they're waiting, and I know that one day they'll come back. But at least now you know, if you ever see that light, if you ever wake up at exactly 2 a.m. with no memory of falling asleep, well, you're not crazy, you're not alone. Just don't look out your window. Trust me on this one. Redditor 8. The mechanical whine pierced my consciousness like a drill through bone. My first instinct was to blame my alarm clock. It was the logical explanation. I fumbled in the darkness, my fingers finding the familiar plastic buttons of the clock radio on my nightstand. Click, click, click. Nothing changed. The sound persisted, a high-pitched electronic shriek that seemed to bore directly into my skull. I pressed my palms against my ears, expecting the noise to diminish. Instead, it maintained its crystal clarity as if it were being transmitted directly into my brain. My heart began to race as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. It was then that I saw them. 3 dark figures stood at the foot of my bed, their forms slightly fuzzy around the edges, like shadows given depth and substance. They were tall, unnaturally so, their heads nearly brushing against my bedroom ceiling. I couldn't make out any distinct features, no faces, no arms. Just 3 pillar-like shapes of absolute darkness that seemed to drink in what little ambient light filtered through my curtains. I had moved in with my parents just a few months prior, after helping them relocate from the bustling city to this secluded property. At 24, with a promising new job, I'd wanted to give them a peaceful retirement, away from the urban chaos. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd moved them to escape the city's dangers, only to encounter something far more terrifying in this quiet countryside. The figures didn't move at first, they just watched. I could feel their attention on me like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. My throat constricted as primal terror coursed through my veins. This wasn't the kind of fear you feel watching a horror movie or walking alone at night. This was something deeper, more visceral. A recognition on a cellular level that I was in the presence of something completely outside my understanding of reality. I tried to scream for my mother, just like I had as a child after a nightmare, but my voice refused to work. My vocal cords felt frozen, paralyzed by that same otherworldly force that was generating the mechanical whine in my head. The sound seemed to intensify, becoming more complex, almost like it contained patterns or messages I couldn't quite decipher. When the figures began to move, they didn't walk. They glided. Their motion was smooth, deliberate, and completely silent. As they approached the side of my bed, I could feel the temperature in the room plummet. My breath came out in visible puffs of vapor, despite it being a warm summer night. The darkness of their forms seemed to deepen, if that was even possible, becoming holes in reality itself. I pulled my blanket up to my chin, a childish gesture of protection that I knew would be useless against whatever these entities were. My mind raced through possibilities, burglars, hallucinations, a vivid dream, but none of these explanations felt right. This was something else entirely, something older, something alien. In that moment, as the figures loomed over me and the mechanical whine reached a fever pitch, I made a conscious decision. Fighting seemed pointless. Running wasn't an option, so I did the only thing I could think of. I surrendered. I closed my eyes, released my death grip on the blanket, and let go of my fear. The last thing I remember was a sensation of floating before consciousness slipped away from me like water through open fingers. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through my window, feeling surprisingly well-rested. The events of the night felt simultaneously distant and crystal clear, like a vivid dream that refuses to fade with waking. The mechanical sound was gone, and my room looked exactly as it always had, but the memory of that bone-deep terror remained, a psychological bruise that wouldn't fade. I made my way downstairs, trying to shake off the lingering unease. My mother was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as she did every morning. I took a seat at the table, watching her move about the kitchen with practiced ease. Finally, I gathered my courage and told her about my experience, half expecting her to dismiss it as a nightmare. Instead, she turned to me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of relief and concern that made my blood run cold. "We didn't want to worry or scare you," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "But we saw 3 ghosts by your bedroom last night." That was when everything changed. The foundation of my reality cracked, and through those cracks, long-buried memories began to seep. Over the next 13 years, more pieces of the puzzle would surface, each one more incredible than the last. Books about alien encounters would find their way to me through the strangest coincidences. I'd discover countless accounts of experiences that began exactly as mine had, with that distinctive mechanical whine and the appearance of shadow figures. The memories that returned weren't always clear or complete, but they painted a picture of repeated encounters, of experiences my mind had carefully wrapped in layers of forgetfulness for my own protection. That night wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment when the carefully constructed walls of denial began to crumble. Now, when I look back on that night, I understand it was a turning point. Those 3 dark figures weren't there to harm me. They were there to wake me up, to make me remember. The mechanical sound wasn't just noise. It was a key, unlocking doors in my mind I hadn't even known existed. Sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm alone, I still hear echoes of that mechanical whine, like a distant radio signal trying to tune in. And in those moments, I know they're still out there, still watching, still waiting. The question isn't whether they'll return. It's whether I'm ready to remember everything else they've shown me over the years. The truth is, I'm still piecing it all together, still trying to reconcile what I experienced with what we're taught is possible. But one thing I know for certain, that night in 2000 wasn't just a ghost story or a dream. It was the moment the universe reached out and showed me that reality is far stranger, far more complex than we're prepared to admit. And sometimes, late at night, when I catch movement in the corners of my vision or feel that familiar drop in temperature, I wonder if they're back. Part of me hopes they are, because now, after all these years, I finally have questions I want to ask. Redditor 9. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night on my family's farm. Some nights, when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m. and hear the distant echo of what might be voices carried on the wind, I wonder if I should have kept it buried in the past. But there's something about reaching your 30s that makes you want to excavate old wounds, even if just to prove to yourself they were real. I was 16 then, living in that sweet spot between childhood and adulthood where everything felt possible and nothing could touch us. My friends and I had turned my family's old camp shack into our weekend kingdom. No electricity, no running water, just a propane lantern, a battery-powered boombox, and the kind of freedom you can only find in places forgotten by time. That October night started like any other. My best friend Mike and I were doing our usual patrol on the four-wheeler, waiting for the others to arrive. The air had that crisp autumn bite that made everything feel more alive, more electric. We'd climbed to the highest point on the property where you could see for miles in every direction. That's when we first noticed it, a strange glow hovering just above the tree line. "Harvest moon," Mike said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that made my stomach clench. I wanted to believe him, but as we circled back up after riding the lower trails, that light had changed. It wasn't the warm amber of a rising moon, but something sickly, a pulsing, orange oval that seemed to blur at the edges like a smudged photograph. It hung there, watching us, while we pretended not to watch it back. The arrival of our other friends was a relief. We retreated to the camp, dealing cards by lantern light and acting like the world outside our little shack didn't exist. But there was an undercurrent of tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. When Jason suggested building a fire outside, I jumped at the chance. Fire was familiar. Fire made sense. We gathered around the flames, music playing just loud enough to drown out the thoughts none of us wanted to voice. Carter was sprawled in his hammock at the edge of our circle, closest to where the firelight surrendered to the woods. I remember the exact moment his face changed, how the easy smile dissolved into something else entirely. "Guys," he said, then louder. "Guys, shut up." We laughed at first. Carter was always trying to spook us with something. But then I saw his hands gripping the hammock's edges, knuckles white in the firelight. And that's when we heard them. The voices. They came from everywhere and nowhere. A cacophony of whispers and shouts that seemed to circle our little haven. Some sounded angry, others urgent, all of them just clear enough to almost understand, but never quite resolving into words I could grasp, except for one phrase that cut through the noise like a knife. "Shut up." The music died. We sat frozen, our breath creating little clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then silence crashed down so completely it felt like cotton in my ears. The jingling started soft, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, but it grew, multiplied, became frantic. My blood ran cold as I recognized it, the sound of our dairy cows' collars. Then came the mooing, but not the gentle lowing I'd grown up with. These were sounds of pure animal terror, primal and desperate. Everyone else bolted for their cars, but I couldn't. Those were my family's cows, my responsibility. I grabbed Tommy's arm before he could reach his truck. "Drive me to the field," I said. It wasn't a request. The headlights cut through the darkness like dull knives, revealing a scene that still haunts me. Several cows stood stock still in the field, their eyes reflecting the light like mirrors as they continued those awful distress calls. The rest were running, actually running, toward the barn a mile away. In all my years growing up on that farm, I'd never seen a cow do more than an awkward trot, but these animals were in full flight, their heavy bodies somehow achieving speeds that shouldn't have been possible. We made several passes with the headlights, but whatever had spooked them remained hidden in the darkness. The cows that had run to the barn were huddled together when we checked on them, sides heaving, steam rising from their bodies despite the cold. Their eyes held something I'd never seen in a cow before. Awareness. They knew something was out there, something that didn't belong in their world or ours. We ended up at Tommy's house, none of us willing to be alone. We sat in his basement until dawn, barely speaking, jumping at every creak and groan of the house settling. The orange light was gone from the sky, but its presence had left an indelible mark on all of us. Years later, I ran into Carter at a gas station. We made small talk about jobs and families, dancing around the elephant in the room until finally he asked, "Do you ever think about that night?" I nodded. "I've been to a lot of places, seen a lot of things," he said, his eyes fixed on something distant. "But I've never heard anything like those voices again. Like they were speaking English but weren't." I wanted to tell him about how I still checked the tree line every night before bed, looking for that sickly orange glow. How the cows in that field were never quite the same, always more skittish, always watching the sky. How sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I can still hear the echo of those voices, carrying impossible words on the wind. Instead, I just said, "Me neither." We left it at that. Some experiences are too vast, too strange to be contained by mere words. But sometimes, when I'm driving past our old farm at night and see the moon rising orange through the trees, I remember how it felt to stand at the edge of everything we thought we knew about the world and realize how little we actually understood. The cows know better now. They always head to the barn before dark, no matter the season. And if you listen carefully on autumn nights, beneath the sound of wind in the trees and distant traffic, you might hear the gentle jingling of their collars, a reminder that some things are better left unexplained.